Some doors aren't locked to keep you out. They're waiting for the right moment to be opened. The rain had already started when Ethan Cole stepped out of his truck, the cold air carrying that faint metallic scent that comes just before a long night. And beside him, Rex moved slower than usual, his paws silent on the cracked pavement, as if he were listening to something the world hadn't spoken yet. The old St. Mercy building stood at the end of the lot, 3 stories of peeling white paint and narrow windows that reflected nothing back, like a place that had forgotten how to be seen. And for a moment Ethan just stood there, hands in his jacket pockets, feeling that quiet pressure in his chest that always came when something didn't quite feel right, though he couldn't name it. Not yet. Just another job, he muttered under his breath. But Rex didn't move, his amber eyes fixed on the building, ears tilted forward in that precise way Ethan had learned to trust more than any alarm or warning sign. And it made him pause, just long enough to notice how still everything was. No wind, no distant traffic, not even the hum of power lines. Only the soft ticking of cooling metal from the truck behind them. Inside, the air was colder than outside, carrying the faint smell of old antiseptic and damp wood, the kind of smell that lingers long after people are gone. And Ethan's boots echoed down the hallway in slow, measured steps while Rex stayed close, not ahead like usual, but right at his side, alert, calculating, as if every inch forward mattered. The overhead lights flickered, weakly, casting thin shadows that stretched too far across the floor, and somewhere deeper in the building, a loose hinge creaked once, then fell silent again, like a breath held too long. They moved past empty rooms with rusted bed frames and broken cabinets, the remnants of a place that once held voices and now held only echoes, until they reached the far end of the corridor where the walls narrowed slightly, and the paint seemed newer, cleaner, as if someone had tried to preserve just this one section from time. That's when Rex stopped. Not hesitated, not slowed, stopped completely, his body stiff, ears locked forward, a low vibration building in his chest that wasn't quite a growl, but something deeper, older, and Ethan felt it before he heard it, that subtle shift in the air, like the room itself had noticed them. "What is it, boy?" he asked quietly, though he already knew Rex wouldn't react like this without reason. And as Ethan took one step closer to the white door at the end of the hall, Rex moved in front of him, blocking his path, firm and unyielding, his eyes flicking from the door back to Ethan as if trying to say something words couldn't carry. Ethan frowned, glancing at the door, noticing for the first time the old nails driven into its frame, the faint marks around the edges, the way the floorboards just beneath it looked slightly uneven, almost as if something had shifted beneath them years ago and never settled back into place. Then, just as he reached out, barely an inch from the handle, the sound came, soft, distant, almost too faint to believe at first, a single, slow tap from somewhere beyond, followed by another, and another, steady and deliberate, not random, not accidental, and Rex's body tightened instantly, pressing closer, refusing to let him move any further, because whatever was waiting on the other side of that door wasn't where the sound was coming from at all. The tapping did not stop, it continued in that slow, deliberate rhythm, each knock spaced just far enough apart to feel intentional, and Ethan felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise as Rex shifted his weight, pressing closer to the floor instead of the door, his nose low, his focus no longer fixed on the wood in front of them, but on the narrow strip of floorboards just beneath the threshold. Ethan lowered his hand, withdrawing it from the handle, and crouched slowly, his fingers brushing against the worn surface where years of footsteps had smoothed the grain. And for a moment, everything seemed to hold its breath, even the rain outside softening against the windows as if it too were listening. "You hear that?" he whispered, though Rex had already answered, the dog's ears twitching with each faint sound, not reacting with fear, but with a steady, controlled tension that Ethan recognized from long nights overseas when silence meant something was waiting just beneath it. Another tap came, slightly louder this time, followed by something else, a faint vibration that traveled through the wood and into Ethan's palm, subtle but unmistakable, like a pulse hidden under the surface. He pressed his hand flat against the floor and closed his eyes for a second, counting without meaning to, the way he used to time distant signals. And there it was again, a pattern, not random at all. Rex let out a low breath, almost a warning, then shifted his paw forward and scratched once, directly at the seam where two boards met. And Ethan followed the motion, noticing the thin line of dust that had settled unevenly along the edge, disturbed at some point. Though nothing around it had been touched in years, the hallway behind them remained empty, but it felt different now, heavier, as if the building itself was leaning closer, listening alongside them. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small flashlight, angling the beam across the floor, and the light revealed something he had missed before. A faint outline beneath the wood, a rectangle too precise to be natural, its edges softened by time but still there, waiting. "This is not about the door," he murmured, more to himself than to Rex, and the dog's tail gave a single, slow movement, not wagging, but acknowledging, as if that truth had been clear to him from the moment they stepped inside. The tapping came again, steadier now, and beneath it, barely audible, there was another sound. Not quite a voice, not quite a machine, but something in between, a thin thread of sound that seemed to rise from below the floor rather than behind the walls, and Ethan felt a strange calm settle over him, the kind that came when confusion began to take shape into understanding. He shifted his weight and ran his fingers along the edge of the board, testing it gently, and it moved, just slightly, enough to confirm what Rex had been trying to tell him all along. This place had not been silent. It had been waiting, and whatever was making that sound had not been trapped behind the door. It had been sealed. Beneath them, hidden in a space no one had thought to check, and Rex had known before anyone else. Because some truths do not call out loudly. They knock, patiently, until someone finally listens. The board lifted with a soft, reluctant creak, the sound of wood separating. After years of silence, and the moment it shifted, the air changed, a cooler breath rising from the darkness below, as if the building itself had exhaled something it had been holding for decades. Ethan paused, his hand resting on the edge, listening, because the tapping had stopped, replaced now by that faint, almost mechanical hum that seemed to echo through the narrow opening. And Rex leaned forward, not rushing, not panicking, but lowering his head slowly, his nose hovering just above the gap as his ears flicked with careful precision. Ethan widened the opening inch by inch, the beam of his flashlight slipping into the space beneath the floor and catching on something metallic, a dull reflection hidden under layers of dust and time. And as the light steadied, shapes began to form, not random debris, but structure. A small recessed compartment built deliberately beneath the threshold, too precise to be accidental, too concealed to be easily found. The air carried a faint scent of old oil and paper, and beneath it, something softer, almost like fabric that had been sealed away for too long. And Ethan felt that quiet pull again, the same instinct that had guided him through moments when logic fell short, but something deeper insisted there was more to see. "Easy," he murmured, more to himself than to Rex, and the dog shifted slightly, giving him space but never losing focus, his presence steady, grounding, as if reminding Ethan that whatever waited below had already been sensed, already been acknowledged. Ethan reached down carefully, his fingers brushing against the metal surface, and as he cleared away a thin layer of dust, the outline of a small hatch became visible, its edges worn but intact, secured not by locks but by time itself. And just beside it, barely visible under the beam of light, was a narrow strip of something else, a wire, thin and aged, running deeper into the compartment and disappearing into shadow. The hum grew slightly louder when his hand moved closer, not threatening, not sharp, but rhythmic, like a quiet heartbeat sustained by something still functioning long after it should have stopped. Ethan hesitated for a brief second, his thoughts drifting to all the years this place had stood untouched, all the footsteps that had passed over this exact spot, without ever knowing what lay beneath them. And then he gently lifted the hatch. Inside, the space opened just enough to reveal a compact arrangement of objects, carefully placed, protected from the outside world, and at the center of it all was a small, old device, its casing worn but intact, connected to that same thin wire. And as the light settled on it, Ethan realized what he had been hearing was not random at all. It was a recorded signal, repeating, sustained by a mechanism that had somehow endured the passage of time. Beside the device lay a folded piece of cloth, and beneath it, A small notebook, its edges yellowed, its cover marked by faint lettering that had nearly faded away. And for a moment Ethan did not move, because something about the arrangement felt intentional, as if it had been left not just to be hidden, but to be found by someone willing to listen long enough. Rex let out a quiet breath and lowered himself beside the opening, his posture easing just slightly, not fully relaxed, but no longer warning, and Ethan understood that. Whatever had been sealed beneath this floor had not been meant to harm. It had been meant to endure, to wait, to speak in the only way it could, through a signal that never stopped reaching upward, hoping that one day, someone would finally hear it. The hum steadied as Ethan lifted the small device into the light, its weight lighter than he expected, as if time had hollowed it out from the inside. And for a moment he simply held it there, listening, feeling the faint vibration against his palm like a quiet pulse that refused to fade. The casing was scratched but intact, its surface marked with fine lines that suggested careful use rather than neglect. And when he turned it slightly, the sound shifted, not louder, but clearer, revealing something beneath the static, a pattern layered under the hum, almost like a voice trying to surface through years of silence. Rex watched closely, his head tilted just enough to follow every movement, his eyes steady, not alarmed, but deeply focused, as if the meaning of what they had found mattered more than the object itself. Ethan set the device gently on the edge of the opening and reached for the notebook, brushing away dust with slow, deliberate movements, and as he opened it, the pages resisted at first, their edges stiff from age, but they gave way, revealing lines of handwriting that had faded but not disappeared, each word pressed into the paper with a kind of quiet urgency that lingered even now. The ink had softened into a pale gray, but the shape of the letters remained strong, careful, almost methodical, and Ethan leaned closer, reading the first line silently before letting the words form in his mind. Because something about them felt too personal to speak aloud right away, the notebook did not begin like a record or a report. It began like a message, written not for documentation, but for someone who had not yet arrived. And that realization settled over him slowly, like the first light before dawn. Rex shifted again, lowering himself beside Ethan, his body relaxed now, but still attentive, as if he understood that the danger had never been physical, but something deeper, something tied to time and memory rather than immediate threat. Ethan turned another page, and the faint hum from the device seemed to align with the rhythm of his movement, almost as if the two were connected, the sound and the words working together to complete something that had been left unfinished. He glanced back at the open hatch, at the narrow space beneath the floor where all of this had been hidden, and for the first time, the building no longer felt empty. It felt patient, like it had been holding this moment in place, waiting for someone to reach the exact point where listening became understanding. Outside, the rain softened further, tapping gently against the distant windows, echoing the earlier rhythm that had drawn them here, and Ethan realized that the pattern had never changed, only his awareness of it had. He traced a line of text with his finger, following the curve of each letter, and felt a quiet shift inside himself, the kind that comes when a story begins to reveal not just what happened, but why it was never meant to disappear. Rex let out a slow breath, his eyes lifting, briefly toward the door they had never opened, and then back to Ethan, as if confirming what they both now understood, that whatever truth had been sealed here was not waiting behind the obvious path, but beneath it, hidden in the place no one thought to search, and it had endured not because it was forgotten, but because it was meant to be found only when someone was ready to see beyond the surface. The next page carried a different weight, the handwriting pressing deeper into the paper as if the person who wrote it had been running out of time, and Ethan felt that shift immediately, the quiet calm from before giving way to something more urgent, more deliberate, as though the words themselves were trying to reach across the years and hold his attention in place. He leaned closer, the beam of his flashlight narrowing over the page, and as his eyes followed the lines, the faint hum from the device changed again, no longer just a steady tone but layered now with a soft, looping fragment of sound that almost resembled a melody, delicate and incomplete, like something remembered but never finished. Rex lifted his head at the same moment, ears angling slightly, his gaze fixed not on Ethan but on the device. as if the sound carried meaning beyond what a human ear could fully catch. Ethan turned the page slowly, careful not to tear the fragile edges, and beneath the next layer of writing, a small photograph slipped loose, drifting down onto the floor beside the opening. He picked it up, brushing away the dust, and for a moment the world around him seemed to narrow to that single image. A child standing beside a woman in a uniform he recognized instantly, the kind worn in medical units decades ago. The edges of the photo worn, but the expressions still clear, still alive in a way that resisted the passage of time. Something about the child's eyes held his attention longer than it should have, a familiarity that did not make sense yet felt impossible to ignore, like recognizing a reflection before understanding where it came from. Rex moved closer, his nose hovering just above the photograph, then shifting to the notebook, then back again, connecting the pieces in a way that Ethan could feel but not yet fully see. The hum from the device grew slightly louder, and this time the melody beneath it carried a clearer shape, a lullaby, soft and steady, the same one they had heard before, but now it felt closer, more present, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to reveal itself fully. Ethan swallowed slowly, his throat dry, and returned his focus to the page, where the handwriting had changed again, the lines less even now, more hurried, but still controlled, still intentional, and he began to understand that this was not just a record of events. It was a message left with purpose, designed to guide whoever found it towards something deeper than the objects themselves. He glanced once more at the open hatch, at the hidden space that had preserved all of this, and then back to the photograph in his hand, feeling that quiet pull grow stronger, the sense that the story unfolding here was not separate from him, but somehow connected, woven into his own past in a way he had never expected. Rex settled beside him, his body finally easing into stillness, his role no longer to warn, but to witness, and Ethan realized that whatever had been hidden beneath this floor had not only endured, it had waited for someone who would not just uncover it, but understand why it had been left behind in the first place. The photograph felt heavier the longer Ethan held it, as if the paper itself carried more than just an image, and he turned it slightly under the flashlight, revealing a faint inscription along the back that had been nearly erased by time. The ink thinned but still present enough to follow if you looked closely. He traced the letters slowly, sounding them out in his mind, and something inside him shifted, not sharply, but like a memory beginning to rise from a place he had not visited in years. Rex watched him, quiet and steady, his presence no longer tense but deeply aware, as if he understood that the moment unfolding had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with recognition. Ethan lowered himself to sit beside the open hatch, the cool air brushing against his face, and returned to the notebook, turning another page with care, his fingers more deliberate now, more respectful, as though he were no longer just searching, but listening. The handwriting had changed again, softer this time, less hurried, almost reflective, and as his eyes moved across the lines, the pieces began to settle into place, not all at once, but gradually, like a pattern that had been there from the beginning but required the right angle to see clearly. The device beside him continued its quiet rhythm, the lullaby now unmistakable, its melody simple but steady, looping without interruption, and Ethan realized that it had not been playing randomly. It had been triggered, awakened by something, perhaps the shift in the floor, perhaps the presence of movement above it, as if it had been designed to respond to the return of life after long silence. He glanced back at the door behind him, still closed, still untouched, and felt a quiet understanding settle in, that the door had never been the point. It had only been the distraction, the obvious barrier that kept people from noticing what lay beneath their feet. Rex let out a slow breath and rested his head lightly against Ethan's knee, grounding him in the present, and Ethan reached down absently, his hand brushing through the dog's fur, steadying himself as the words in the notebook began to connect more clearly with the image in his hand. The name written there, faint but undeniable, echoed something he had heard before, not recently, not in any clear memory, but somewhere deeper, tied to stories he had been told as a child, fragments of conversations he had never fully understood at the time. The realization did not come as a shock, but as a quiet unfolding, a recognition that this was not just a forgotten story belonging to someone else, It was part of a thread that had been moving toward him long before he ever stepped into this building. The rain outside had softened to a gentle whisper, tapping lightly against the glass. And the entire space felt different now, no longer empty, no longer abandoned, but filled with a presence that was not visible yet deeply felt, like a memory that had been waiting patiently for the moment it could finally be seen. Ethan closed the notebook halfway, his thumb resting between the pages as if marking a place he was not ready to leave yet, and looked once more at the small hidden compartment beneath the floor, understanding now that it had not been built to conceal something forever, but to protect it until the right person arrived, someone who would not only uncover it, but recognize what it meant. And as Rex lifted his head slightly, meeting Ethan's gaze with quiet certainty, it became clear that this moment had never been an accident. It had been a return. The silence that followed felt different now, not empty but full, as if every inch of the building had shifted to make space for what was being understood, and Ethan sat there with the notebook resting lightly in his hand, the photograph beside him, and the quiet hum still threading through the air like a steady reminder that this moment had been set in motion long before he arrived. He turned the page again, slower this time, not out of caution but out of respect, and the words that followed carried a tone that was no longer urgent or hurried, but calm, almost certain, as if the person who wrote them had finally reached a point where fear had given way to clarity. Rex adjusted beside him, his body fully at ease now, his breathing slow and even, yet his eyes remained open, watching, not the space around them but Ethan himself, as if the final piece of this discovery depended not on what they would find next, but on how Ethan would choose to understand it. The device continued its quiet melody, the lullaby now, clear and unbroken, each note steady, each pause intentional, and Ethan realized that it was not simply repeating, it was guiding, marking time in a way that felt almost deliberate, like a signal meant to align with something beyond sound alone. He glanced again at the photograph, turning it over once more, and the faint inscription seemed clearer now, as though the act of recognition had sharpened what time had tried to erase, and the name written there no longer felt distant or unfamiliar. It felt close, tied to a part of his life he had never fully explored, a story that had been told in fragments and then quietly set aside. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting the pieces settle, and in that stillness, something became unmistakably clear. The notebook, the device, the hidden compartment, none of it had been random. It had been arranged with purpose, preserved with care, and left in a place where it would only be discovered by someone willing to look beyond what was obvious. Rex shifted slightly, placing his head more firmly against Ethan's leg, a small gesture that carried more reassurance than any words could have, and Ethan opened his eyes again, his gaze steady now, no longer searching, but understanding. He reached into the compartment once more, his hand moving with quiet certainty, and this time he noticed something he had overlooked before, tucked beneath the edge of the notebook, partially hidden by the cloth, a thin envelope, its surface worn but intact, its presence subtle enough to be missed unless you were truly paying attention. He lifted it carefully, feeling the weight of it, light but significant, and as his fingers traced along its edge, the hum from the device shifted ever so slightly, not louder, not sharper, but different, as if acknowledging the discovery. The building around them remained still, the rain now barely audible against the windows, and Ethan understood in that moment that whatever was inside that envelope was not just another piece of the story. It was the reason the story had been left here at all, the final part that connected everything, not just to the past, but to him. And as Rex lifted his head and looked at him with that same steady awareness, it became clear that some truths are not hidden because they are meant to stay lost, but because they are waiting for the one person who will recognize them when they are finally found. The envelope felt fragile in Ethan's hands, the paper softened by years of stillness, yet it held together as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to be opened, and he paused for just a breath, not out of hesitation, but because something inside him understood that whatever lay within would not simply add to the story, it would complete it. Rex shifted closer, his gaze steady, his presence quiet but unmistakably aware, as though he had followed every step of this path long before Ethan ever saw it, and now stood at the edge of its final turn. Ethan slid a finger beneath the flap and lifted it carefully, the faint sound of paper parting carrying through the silence like a soft echo, and inside, there was a single folded letter, its edges worn but precise, placed with intention rather than haste. He unfolded it slowly, the motion deliberate, and as the page opened, the hum from the device softened, almost fading into the background, as if it had done what it was meant to do, guiding him here, and now allowing the rest to unfold without interruption. The handwriting on this page was different from the notebook, steadier, more composed, each letter shaped with care, and as Ethan began to read, the words did not feel distant or detached. They felt direct, as though they had been written not just for someone, but for him. The message did not begin with explanation. It began with acknowledgement, a quiet recognition of time passing, of choices made in moments that could not be undone, and of a truth that had been protected not out of fear, but out of hope that it would one day reach the right hands. Ethan's breath slowed as he moved through the lines, each sentence unfolding something deeper, not in sudden revelation, but in a steady, undeniable clarity that settled into place with each word. The name that had lingered in the photograph now appeared again, written fully, unmistakably, and alongside it, a connection that bridged years he had never thought to question. Linking the fragments of his own past to this hidden space beneath the floor, Rex lowered himself completely beside him, resting calmly, his role fulfilled, yet his presence still anchoring the moment, as if reminding Ethan that this was not something to rush, but something to understand fully. The letter spoke of a decision made quietly, of a child protected, of a path altered so that a life could continue beyond the reach of circumstances that would have taken it somewhere else entirely. And as Ethan read, the pieces aligned, not as a shock, but as a truth that had always been there, waiting for the moment it could be seen clearly. The rain outside had nearly stopped, leaving only a faint whisper against the windows, and the building, once heavy with silence, now felt lighter, as though it had released something it had carried for far too long. Ethan lowered the letter slightly, his eyes lingering on the final lines, and in that stillness, he understood that this had never been about uncovering something hidden. It had been about remembering something that had never truly been lost, and as Rex lifted his head just enough to meet his gaze, there was a quiet certainty in that look, a confirmation that some paths are not found by chance, but by the quiet persistence of truths that wait until they are ready to be seen. For a long moment, Ethan did not move, the letter still open in his hands as the weight of its meaning settled quietly into place, not like a sudden revelation, but like something that had always been there, waiting for him to be ready to understand it. And the stillness around him seemed to deepen, not empty, but full of something softer now, something that felt less like a mystery and more like a resolution. The device beside him had gone nearly silent, its faint hum reduced to a barely noticeable whisper, as if its purpose had been fulfilled, and Rex remained at his side, calm and steady, his presence no longer alert or searching, but peaceful, as though he had guided Ethan exactly where he needed to be and now had nothing left to warn him about. Ethan folded the letter carefully, smoothing its edges with quiet respect before placing it back into the envelope, not to hide it again, but to carry it forward, and as he did, he glanced once more at the small compartment beneath the floor, at the notebook, the photograph, the device, all of it arranged with intention, all of it preserved through time not by accident, but by design. He reached down and gently closed the hatch, the wood settling back into place with a soft, final sound that felt less like an ending and more like a promise kept. And when he stood, the room no longer felt heavy or uncertain. It felt complete, as if something long unfinished had finally found its way to the surface. The white door at the end of the hallway remained unopened, untouched, and Ethan looked at it one last time, understanding now that it had never held the answers he was searching for. It had only stood there as a reminder that the most important truths are rarely found where people expect them to be. He turned away from it without hesitation, his steps steady as he moved back down the hallway, the faint echoes of his boots no longer hollow but grounded, connected to something deeper than the empty space around him. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, leaving the air clear and still, and as he stepped out into the quiet evening, the sky had begun to open just enough for a soft light to break through the clouds, casting a gentle glow across the worn pavement. Rex walked beside him, relaxed now, his tail low and calm, no longer searching, no longer signaling, just present, as if he too understood that their part in this story had reached its natural end. Ethan paused beside his truck, looking back once at the old building, not with suspicion or unease, but with a quiet sense of gratitude, because what had been hidden there was never meant to stay lost. It had simply been waiting for someone who would listen long enough to hear it. He opened the door, the familiar creak of metal grounding him in the present, and as Rex climbed in and settled into his place, Ethan took one last breath of the cool evening air, feeling the weight of the past not as a burden, but as something that had finally found its way home. And as the engine turned over and the headlights cut softly through the fading light, he drove away not searching for what was missing, but carrying with him something that had been waiting, patiently, to be found.